This is chapter 3, part 4. We left off last time talking about some various aspects of the legal understanding of insanity. Let's pick up and continue there. In 1984, the federal government uh, should say changed the criminal code and abolished the irresistible impulse test. Many states have followed by making it more difficult to use the insanity defense. So, as we said in the last segment, um, there has been this irresistible impulse idea that even if you understood that the crime was bad, but you couldn't help yourself, you were overcome by your mental disease and could not resist and committed the crime, you could be found under that sort of rule. You could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Well, in 1984, the federal government weighed in on that and said, according to federal law, we're not going to follow this irresistible impulse test. If we're not going to accept it if you plead that, if you argue that you couldn't help yourself due to mental illness, you couldn't help yourself and could not stop yourself from committing the crime. And just a historical note is that this was 1984, a few years after um, uh, an attempt was made on President Reagan's life. There was an attempted assassination, and Hinckley, who committed that crime, um, wanted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and that was a very high-profile, famous case. And the politicians responded to this kind of, this sort of defense by saying, no, we're not going to go for that. We're going to pass this criminal code, which does not go for this irresistible impulse test. And the only thing we're going to respect when it comes to insanity, pleading insanity, is going to be that you you are insane if uh, you don't understand right from wrong when you commit the crime. So many states followed these stricter federal uh, laws by making similar changes in their own laws, and making it more difficult to use this insanity defense, specifically with this irresistible impulse idea. So so that long story short is that states, federal government, and juries are more skeptical about agreeing that someone is not guilty by reason of insanity. Several states have a I should say, guilty but insane defense in which a person is placed in a psychiatric facility under the condition until their condition improves. Next, they are transferred to a prison to finish their sentence. So you can see here a little bit of a moderate, middle of the road idea that yes, you were mentally insane when you committed the crime, but we're still going to hold you guilty for it anyway. And the way we're going to deal with this is we're going to put you in a mental facility until you're healed, until your mental disease is sort of eliminated and you're healthy again. And when you're healthy, then we'll go ahead and transfer you to a prison where you'll finish out your sentence, because we're still going to hold you responsible for this. But it's sort of the middle of the road where we're going to put you in a psychiatric hospital so you can get treatment, because frankly, prisons are not facilities that are really designed well to handle people with mental illness problems. A psychiatric facility is better for that. So I think that's a lot of the thinking behind this guilty but insane defense, is let's get the people the help that they need first to treat their illness, but we're still going to hold them responsible and make them finish out their sentence. Um, so again, kind of a middle of the road approach. Mental disorder um, might be a better term than mental illness, since the latter suggests a degenerative state, whereas many serial killers have steady traits. So yeah, mental disorder um, uh, perhaps suggests that you have a mental problem um, that's sort of a long-lasting one, and it's sort of a stable characteristic that you have, which is true for serial killers, that they tend to have this, motivation, this desire to hurt, to kill people repeatedly, and that's a steady, stable desire and motivation. It's not like they are perfectly healthy and then they sort of have this degenerative state where they go insane and kill somebody, and temporarily insane, and then they come back to sanity and they don't want to do that anymore, ever. It's not like that. It's kind of a steady desire that they might cool off for a while, and not kill people constantly, but that desire is steady and stable. And so that's just a point that the author of the textbook is making, is that we need to realize that these serial killers have these desires in a steady sort of way that can last for many years. Now, we've mentioned this term several times in earlier segments, psychosis. So make sure that you understand what we mean by that. This is a state in which a person loses contact with reality in specific ways. So this is a person who hears voices that aren't there, or sees people or sees things that aren't there, who believes that they're receiving messages from who knows where, aliens, God, the devil, and they're not receiving messages. That's just there in their imagination. And they may have very jumbled thoughts, and when they speak in sort of a word salad that doesn't make sense, a lot of mumbo jumbo. And so it's just in various ways they show a disconnect with reality. They're kind of in their own world and believe things that just simply are imaginary. Now, according to the DSM-5, the psychiatrists, the psychiatric field and psychologists use this handbook of disorders to guide psychiatrists, clinicians in diagnosing people with mental disorders. And so this is something that's updated periodically, but it's pretty consistent from one edition to the next. And so, according to this handbook that they use, psychiatric disorders include one or more of the following symptoms: delusions, where you're sort of believing things that are not connected to reality, or hallucinations, where you're seeing or hearing things that are not actually there. Disorganized speech, that's the kind of crazy, irrational, nonsense speech that you can hear from folks. Or grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. So if you're really showing a lack of function, where you're just not able to run your own life, and they use this term disorganized, grossly disorganized, where your life's a mess, and you just, due to this mental illness, you show the mental illness through an inability to take care of yourself. Or catatonic behavior, where you're kind of referring to a trance, where you'll just stand there and stare off in space, and may stand there frozen, like statue-like, for a long time. You might, drool or something like that, because you're just sort of frozen in a trance. So those are some of the symptoms you would see potentially with a psychotic sort of disorder, or the psychosis that we mentioned just a moment ago. Some psychotic episodes are brief, while others may last a long time. So you do have people who kind of come in and out, who may have psychotic episodes where temporarily they lose contact with reality, but they might kind of recuperate and come back and be more in touch with reality. And it's something they could go in and out on, or it could be something that lasts a long time. And of course, medications are designed to help people get past these episodes and to come back in touch with reality. Now, one thing we need to understand about mental illness and crime, that there's sometimes in the public mind or image, and you see it sometimes in the movies and stories, you get this idea that there's people with mental illnesses are prone to be violent, prone to be criminals, prone to be serial killers. And that's really a stereotype. You need to avoid that, because most of the time, these folks suffering from psychosis, this disconnect from reality, they might be unpredictable. They might be sort of make you uncomfortable because of their irrational behavior or speech, but that doesn't mean that they're violent. And if they are violent, they tend to be, a lot of times it's more suicidal, kind of taking, being harmful, physically harmful towards oneself. So you do see there is a certain element of violence or uh, problematic behavior from these folks because for one thing they have mental problems and they're not able to control their behavior and conform their behavior to the law as easily as other people are. Because we talked in previous segments how if your brain's not functioning correctly, you're going to have a hard time behaving always like you're supposed to. So yeah, so certainly these folks have challenges, but we got to get away from the stereotype that that if you're mentally ill, it means you're scary and you're violent and aggressive and that kind of stuff. You got to be careful about that. According to a study, of those arrested for homicide, only 1% were psychotic. So it's not common for a killer or a seriously violent person to be psychotic. It's you do see it, you see it among serial killers, but it's not common. So that's the main thing we want to stress here. We don't want to draw too much of a connection between these things, and certainly serial killers. You do not most of the time. Most of the time, they're quite connected to reality. They just have no morality. They have no sense of right and wrong, no desire to do what's right. Even though they understand right and wrong, they absolutely do not care to do the right thing. They like doing the wrong thing, the bad thing. So serial killers are not generally psychotic. Small little percentage. We can certainly find cases. We may even cover some this semester. I think it's always good to try to cover all bases, but it's not a common occurrence. So that you need to it seems to me maybe if you watch a lot of these movies on serial killers, it sort of makes it for a dramatic story if they seem psychotic. But that's generally not the case in real life. Now, they do, on the other hand, serial killers tend to have personality disorders. And what we mean by that is having an enduring pattern of inner experience and outward behavior that impairs their sense of self, emotional experiences, capacity for intimacy, and or capacity for or intimacy. So the point here is that a personality disorder is when you have certain traits, certain habits, tendencies of behavior that are problematic that get in the way of you being able to live a normal life, having positive relationships with other people, having sort of emotions within a normal range. So it just means sort of extremes in behavior and personality characteristics that cause you a lot of problems in your life. And there's a variety of different kinds of these that we can talk about. The enduring pattern is inflexible and pervasive across a wide range of situations, and it leads to significant distress or impairment in social and occupational settings. So there's a couple of key things here to understand personality disorders. We're talking about enduring pattern. It doesn't tend to be an episode, a temporary thing. You have these traits that last over time. So we'll later on we'll get into the full list of these personality disorders. But just to give you an example of one that's very common in criminology, is antisocial personality disorder. And so it's a personality disorder that makes you prone to crime. So this is a person who is maybe sort of lacks a conscience, someone who is insensitive to the needs of other people, callous, cold, unfeeling, likes to, sees other people as objects to be exploited, doesn't respect other people's rights, they're manipulative, and they have one thing that will distinguish antisocial personality disorder from psychopathy, which these are very similar concepts, is that antisocial personality disorder individuals, they tend to have a lifestyle, a pattern of behavior which is problematic. They tend to be poor employees, unreliable friends, unreliable boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives. So they have poor quality relationships because they're not responsible and they're abusive, and they're not reliable at work, and so they have a bad pattern of sort of work habits. Um, and they tend to engage in, of course, engage in not only criminal behavior, a range, a variety of criminal behaviors, but other related sorts of things like drug addiction, alcohol abuse, gambling addiction. So they have a whole pattern, a lifestyle of problematic behavior in addition to personality problems. Psychopaths or psychopathy, that concept tends to focuses more on the mind, the thoughts, what's going on inside somebody's head, the disturbed patterns of thinking. So the psychopath, they tend to focus more on thoughts, a little bit more emphasis on behaviors when you look at this antisocial personality disorder. But again, you can see that it's a set of stable traits, habits, it's character. That's what we mean when we say personality traits, the characteristics you have that last over time and in different situations that you tend to behave the same way. So if you have antisocial personality disorder and you're kind of a jerk, you tend to be that way, you know, much of the time over years in lots of different situations. So that's what they mean when they say personality. And of course, by disorder, they mean personality traits that really get you into trouble and cause a lot of dysfunction in your life. Let's see, let's go through. There's just one more, I think, that I want to cover now. Then I think we're going to wrap it up for this week, because I've split this chapter into two parts because there's so much there. So this is what we're going to do here in a moment. I'll stop for this first week, and then next week I'll finish this. I'll do the second half of the chapter, and we'll go over those important points. So I'm kind of breaking things here in half, but it's just because it's a long chapter. So this final point that I'll make is that this pattern is traced back to adolescence or early childhood and is not the result of medication, substance abuse, head trauma, or some medical condition. Well, one point you have to understand about this, when you talk about personality or personality disorders, abnormal personality traits, unhealthy personality traits, just like with healthy ones, healthy personality traits, the researchers in this area tend to focus on the biological roots of personality traits. A lot of the reason why these characteristics last a long time throughout your life and emerge early in life, even when you're a child, is because they have biological roots. They're rooted in the brain, the functioning of the brain, the health, the growth, the development of the brain, the wiring of it. And so the idea is that your personality, your tendency to behave in a certain way, is a reflection of the way that your brain operates, and it's different from person to person to person. Each person is an individual with an individual personality, and we're all on a range from one extreme to the other. But people who have antisocial personality disorder, or some of these other personality disorders we'll talk about, they tend to have extreme personality traits that get them into trouble. They're not in the middle someplace, some healthy middle. They're extreme. They have extreme personality traits. But the point is, according to the personality researchers, that a lot of this is rooted in uh, the way the brain operates, and so there's roots in biology, in how develop from the beginning, from conception through development in the womb, and then early childhood, adolescence, adulthood, etc. So these things start early, and not only are they rooted sort of in biology and brain development, but to some extent, as we mentioned before, that your genetic makeup will influence your brain development, which then in turn influences your personality traits. So this approach tends to focus quite a bit on the biological sources of personality traits. Not 100%, of course, that there's all sorts of things that happen when you're a child, when you're growing up, that can make a difference. But just want to stress that it's a little different, let's say, from what you would learn in a typical sociology class, which focuses on just about purely on circumstances, on your social surroundings, on your family circumstances or school or neighborhood, that kind of thing. This personality disorder approach, the psychiatric approach, shifts more focus and sees more importance on biology, and it tends to treat, by the way, these personality disorders with medications. So with biological therapies, medical therapies. And so it tends to look at these things in a medical way and treat them in a medical way. So that's coming from a different discipline. But the approach in this course is multidisciplinary. We're going to cover everything. We cover sociology, we cover psychology, we cover biology, we cover brain science, you name it. We try to cover all of the bases. And as I've stressed before, one of the reasons why we try to cover all the bases is because we're trying to explain something complicated and rare. And so I think we do have to rely on what all these various fields and disciplines have to teach us to be able to put together this complex puzzle of where these serial killers come from, how they develop their extreme disturbed behaviors. Okay, so we'll stop here. We're cutting the chapter in half. Just a reminder not to worry this week about being quizzed on this material, because you're going to get quizzed on the whole chapter next week. So just remember what we've gone over, but then finish the second half next week prior to taking the quiz. So we'll see you then.